Good afternoon, everyone. I am Brian Beecher, the Director of the Library and Learning Commons here at Grand Rapids Community College. Thank you for coming. I'd like to welcome you to our library in celebration of our semester-long events on the topic of campus safety. Today we have four very special guests. To lead us off, Morgan McCaul, political science and history of art student at the University of Michigan, will begin today by speaking with us about the value of believing, the restorative power of advocacy, and promoting legislative activism. We'll have a panel discussion following Morgan's keynote. She will be joined by Kimberly DeVries, GRCC's Title IX coordinator, Patti Haist, YWCA West Central Michigan Director of Clinical Services, and Stacey Heisler, Interim Program Director of GRCC's Counseling and Career Development Office. Joe Cortade, Coordinator of Student Life, will facilitate a question and answer session during the discussion panel. I would also like to thank the Library and Learning Commons, Campus Common Reading Committee, Media Technologies, and Office of Student Life for their work in making these events possible. If you parked in the student lot today, we'd be happy to validate your parking for you. Please see me or Tony Harrington, and we'll give you a voucher. We also have refreshments over there, so be sure to help yourself to those. And without further ado, please give a nice warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Morgan McCaul. Thank you, Morgan.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for showing up today. When I was 12 years old, I walked unwittingly into the hands of a monster. You already know a little bit about my story from the word survivor on the pamphlets and posters advertising this event, which GRCC has so graciously put on today. But let's put a pin in that for just a moment and lay out some facts. Fact: sexual violence is a horrendous and pervasive public health issue in the United States. According to RAINN, 1 in 9 girls and 1 in 53 boys will be sexually abused or assaulted each year. Every 11 minutes, the Child Protective Services Agency finds evidence to substantiate a claim of child sexual abuse. Fact: the aftershock of sexual violence, the toll it takes on victims and the toll it takes on our societal infrastructure is enormous. Victims of sexual violence are predisposed to suffer from mental health disorders, substance abuse, and suicidal thoughts. This profoundly affects victims, straining relationships and impacting performance at both work and school. A study conducted by the CDC some 20 years ago found that eradicating child abuse in this country would, and I quote, reduce the overall rate of depression by more than half, alcoholism by 2/3, and suicide, intravenous drug use, and domestic violence by 3/4. It is against this overwhelming evidentiary backdrop that I address you today as someone who has experienced child sexual abuse and then experienced repeated sexual violence as an adult. When I was 12 years old, I sustained a severe double hip injury as a result of competitive dance. When I was 12 years old, I walked with a limp as a souvenir from a ballet class gone wrong into the office of former Dr. Lawrence G. Nassar. Back then, I knew him as Larry. In recalling my first episode of sexual abuse, I wrote, "The office was beige and the doctor was a monster, snarling behind a genial facade. The appointment was a red blur of pressure points and stinging fingers, then a pain so unfamiliar I could do nothing but force myself to forget. In my tortured memory, that pain dulled to beige, the same beige as the walls which suffocated from the weight of the athletic iconography. Everyone watched me turn beige that day. Carrie Strug, J.C. Phelps, Dominique Moceanu, Shannon Miller, Dominique Dawes, Amy Chow, and Amy Borden smiled in triumph as I squirmed in agony and utter confusion. The next 5 years were beige. It is extraordinarily difficult to put sexual violence into words. On paper, it's a violation. It's a breach of consent, a physical act inflicted upon a person by another. But in practice, to live and breathe it, sexual violence is something else entirely. It's a carousel of blurry senses coming into clarity. Sometimes I cringe to remember the paralysis and ensuing confusion after my body was abused. Sometimes I recall the collage of Olympic memorabilia, famous athletes and familiar faces that were framed upon the beige wall of that exam room. The smiles and medals that I focused on so fixedly and with gritted teeth to endure. When allegations against my abuser first publicly surfaced in 2016, I was a junior in high school, focused diligently on studying for the SAT and balancing working 2 part-time jobs on top of regular classes. I could not accept these accusations to be true, for if what the woman on the television described was in fact molestation, it would force me to reckon with the answer of what had happened to me. Fast forward 3 years, 3 criminal sentencings, countless hearings, legislative introductions, and testimonies. We're here. And it's my responsibility to share these gut-wrenching statistics, my story, and this space with you all today so that we can start asking the right questions. How do we prevent sexual violence from ever occurring? How do we intervene when violence is occurring? And how do we support victims who have experienced unspeakable violence? I already listed the lasting effects of sexual violence and trauma for you: depression and anxiety and panic and a plethora of uncomfortable and painful realities which so many endure every single day. But what I failed to tell you is that the young woman standing in front of you, I suppose I qualify as a young woman, that it lived in agony for years and had no idea why. I began grappling with the ugly side of trauma when I was 15. I had been abused at over a dozen appointments over the course of 3 years, entirely under the impression that what had happened, though it made me uncomfortable, was medically necessary and benevolent. What I cemented the first time my body was assaulted was a pattern that I would repeat for years. We all have that little voice in our head. Maybe yours comes from the pit of your stomach or deep inside your chest. It's intuition. It's the alarm that sounds when something feels wrong. What I cemented in that office and what I held true for so long was that my gut feelings were wrong, that my feelings lied to me, and that if something felt wrong, that I was the problem. My appointments with Larry Nassar ended in 2015, and the same year, my mental health spiraled absolutely out of control. The little girl that adored dance class couldn't get out the door to the studio, let alone get out of bed. I became anxious, explosive, intensely sensitive to criticism and questions. My grades, which had been pristine, plummeted as school became a scary place. I sobbed night after night, and I begged my parents, a shell of a person covered with her own snot and tears, to let me take online classes. I isolated myself. I couldn't bring myself to spend time with friends or even text them back. I wanted to die. I was hospitalized shortly before my 16th birthday, diagnosed with depression and my parents went from raising me and being proud of me to being on suicide watch. During my time in partial treatment, which, if you don't know, is when you get dropped off in the morning and picked up at night to sleep in your own bed, I learned about self-harm, and that was my primary coping mechanism for months. I hated myself, but I hated myself even more for not knowing why I felt the way I did. It seemed like every day I would ask myself, how could I feel this way when I am so privileged? I have supportive parents, beautiful and interesting siblings and friends. I was a successful student and talented dancer, and I was on the fast track to a great college. When I had so much, how could I feel so small? So after that 2016 phone call, where my mother informed me of the first public allegations against my abuser, and after steeping in the clutches of denial for a few months, I was so distraught that I felt like I had nothing to lose. And I finally told my mom that the accounts that we saw on the nightly news must be true, and that they must be true because it sounded exactly like what had happened to me. And it could sound dramatic, but in that moment of glaring and paralyzing honesty, I felt a shred of my old self come back. And I knew I was onto something. Fast forward to November of 2017. I had started my inaugural year of college at the University of Michigan and connected with a group of 7 women who had also suffered abuse at the hands of my perpetrator. In a circle, one after the other, they shared their stories. They repeated detail after eerily familiar detail. When it was my turn to speak, I broke down because that little voice in my head had been correct. The torture that I had endured years prior was real. It was in that little boardroom in Grand Rapids, after a failed and spectacularly grueling mediation session with Michigan State University, that the 7 women and I decided to become public. The first interview that I gave can only be described as something between a nightmare and a disaster. When the microphone landed in my lap, I couldn't find the words. The room was spinning, and I watched myself flee to a bathroom stall in the middle of a panic attack. But I did another interview, and then another, and another. I was 17 years old, trudging slowly but surely on a path to find my voice. The media whirlwind which surrounded my case brought with it many opportunities to use this newfound voice to speak difficult truths. I started giving presentations to local high schools about consent, healthy relationships, and my own story of sexual assault. My sisters and I introduced legislation into the Michigan legislature that would have substantially changed the landscape for victims of sexual assault coming forward. I have testified in front of committees, organized rallies and protests, given addresses at events across the state, and I'm telling you this not as an ego stroke, but because these experiences have radically changed my life. Using your voice as a survivor of sexual abuse brings about, I have found, 2 particular phenomena. 1, it builds unparalleled community. After every speaking engagement or interview or event I participated, survivors unprompted will share their stories with me. They allow me the privilege of sharing in the knowledge of some of their most vulnerable moments. They let me in, and we share that space with one another. It is more intimate and humbling than anything that I once thought possible. Exchanges like these can be uncomfortable. Sometimes they are emotional or tense. But more often they are cathartic for both parties, myself included. The power of connecting as a survivor is potent. And sharing that space creates an unspoken bond, which I'm so, so lucky to share with a network of people across the state. The second phenomena is that turning to activism and advocacy in the aftermath of my sexual abuse has granted me a sense of agency that, by principle, I was robbed of as a child. Sexual violence is a transgression of power, where a victim's bodily autonomy and dignity are violated. To have an anchor such as this during the most turbulent and troubling moments of the past 2 years has been invaluable. Activism can be a distraction, it can be a creative endeavor, and a way to make sense of the incomprehensible. It forces you to confront the darkest parts of yourself and turn them into something light. Yet the burden of stopping sexual violence ought not to rest on survivors alone. In an ideal world, the only concern a survivor should have is how to safely navigate their healing process. I am hell-bent on creating that world. And that's where I invite you to join me. This work must be proactive and facilitated by a network of allies. This work must be intersectional and inclusive and dynamic. This work must unearth the cultural foundations that led us to this place in the first place. I'm now going to pivot into my latest realm of advocacy, and that's regarding Title IX. If you're not familiar with Title IX, it's a civil rights provision that ensures that students have a right to an education uninterrupted by gender-based violence. And if you're unfamiliar with Title IX, I'm tempted to say you're probably lucky not to have undergone the Title IX process, which is facing substantial revision in this country. In late August of 2018, just after I had moved back to campus in Ann Arbor, our current Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVries, proposed changes to Title IX policy that would bolster the rights of accused parties. It would significantly hinder survivors' access to justice, and it would allow for cross-examination in which rapists and perpetrators could potentially have the opportunity to cross-examine their victims. I was immediately horrified, and so I shot off an admittedly hot-headed tweet. It read, @Betsy DeVries, is ruining lives your idea of a back-to-school welcome? And it got picked up by the New York Times. Since that afternoon that I stumbled into the national conversation regarding sexual assault on college campuses and victims' rights, I've come to be intimately familiar with what survivors face when they file a Title IX report against their perpetrators. And as a current college student, I feel passionately that we have a responsibility to take on this issue. Because sexual violence and gender-based violence do not discriminate based on campus geography or your major or your identity. It's our responsibility to make sure that policies concerned with restorative justice or just plain old justice are crafted with empathy and sensitivity and a survivor-centric approach. In coming forward with my own story of sexual abuse and trying desperately to leverage my story for the betterment of others, I have been told that I am strong, that I am a warrior or an inspiration. But to be unequivocally honest, I don't see myself as any of these things that I definitely aspire to. The truth is that helping others, or at least trying my best to do good in a world that treated me so badly as a child, is what has kept me out of the hospital in the aftermath of confronting my abuser in court. I believe that advocacy has been an invaluable outlet for the anger and frustration and feelings of worthlessness that I struggled with after realizing that I was a victim. At the end of the day, advocacy has been an integral part of my very much ongoing healing process. In speaking up for others, I have found forgiveness and compassion for myself. Thank you so very much for listening today. I'm excited to participate in the panel.
Got it. All right. Sorry, should have grabbed this before. Thank you again, Morgan. And could we have our panelists please join us up here? So we'll be now moving into the panel portion of our discussion. As mentioned, I'm going to reintroduce our panel. So we have Stacey Heisler here, who is a counselor and the current interim director of the Counseling and Career Development Office here at GRCC. We have Patti Haist, who is the Director of Crisis Intervention Services at the YWCA in Grand Rapids. And we have Kimberly DeVries, who is the Coordinator of Title IX and the Director of Equal Opportunity at GRCC as well. And of course, Morgan, who is fantastic, and thank you so much for your powerful words today. All right, first off, let's give Morgan a chance to catch her breath here a little bit and have the rest of the panel go in order and introduce yourselves a little bit more thoroughly and specifically tell us a little bit about your work and how it relates to the conversation on Title IX and supporting survivors of sexual assault.
So my name is Kimberly DeVries. Again, I am the Title IX coordinator here. I'm within the Office of the General Counsel, so I have a legal background. And one of my roles on campus is Title IX. So I work with our response to sexual assault, sexual violence, domestic violence, dating violence. Training around that, compliance, policies, all of that world is what I do. I also deal with equal opportunity complaints, so I deal with discrimination policies within that world as well, so employment opportunity. And then I also deal with ADA compliance, Americans with Disabilities Act compliance. So that is my world. Title IX is obviously why I'm here today, why we're having this conversation. Thank you so much for bringing it up and for helping us bring some knowledge and some power to it. So I'm one of the folks on campus who takes reports from students, who investigates complaints, who works with survivors who report complaints, and then also meets and works with those who are accused of violations of our sexual misconduct policy. So we talk about Title IX, as Morgan explained, is a civil rights law. So we deal with that, but more specifically on campus, we have our sexual misconduct policy, which is how we implement Title IX and how we implement the rules and requirements around Title IX. So you'll hear me refer to our sexual misconduct policy. That's what sets out what our rules and regulations are here, related to what behavior is not acceptable, related to what sanctions could be, our process, and all of that. So that is my world.
And I'm Patti Haist with the YWCA, which is about 4 blocks from here on the west side of Fulton Street. And the YWCA has an array of services for sexual assault survivors, including Michigan's first sexual assault nurse examiner program, which has been in existence for over 22 years. And we say that it's the best kept secret in Grand Rapids because unless you have needed it yourself or have known someone who has needed it, it's really not well advertised. But victims of sexual assault come to us for their medical forensic examination, no longer needing to go to a hospital emergency room. And our hospitals know that this is not a patient population that they serve well. And so, you know, that in the past, when victims were going to the emergency departments, they would be there for hours because the more medically urgent patients, gunshot victims, car accidents, heart attacks, they would take priority over the rape victim. And now, if we know what time the patient is coming to us, from the time they get there until the time they leave is usually about a 2-hour time frame. The only criteria of using our service is that, well, there's two. The time frame from the assault has to be within 120 hours, and the victim needs to be able to consent to the exam. If, say, that the alcohol was involved as part of the assault and the victim is intoxicated, we would say, you know, take some time to sleep, and then, you know, we can do your exam tomorrow. So if it would still be within that 120 hours or 5 days. So that's part of our services. We also offer what we call crisis advocacy to victims of sexual assault, and that is where an advocate would meet with them and kind of help navigate the process. It may be, if they're reporting to the police, to be an advocate through that process. It may be that they simply need someone to talk to and sort out feelings. So that's a service that we offer, as well as a support group for sexual assault survivors. And then therapy services are also available. So that's kind of what we do at the YWCA.
Again, my name is Stacey Heisler, and I am the Interim Program Director and a counselor, a licensed professional counselor in the Counseling and Career Development office, and it's located in the Student Center on the 3rd floor, where you buy your books, the Raider Grill, all of those, very central location. All of you know where that's located. I have been counseling college students for over 20 years now. As a program director, this is a new role, just of the past 3 months. I do want to say, though, thank you, Morgan, for being here. I'm so happy to hear that you've found your voice. Surely you're an inspiration to many. I know you may not want to hear the inspiration part, but I'm sure that you are. We provide confidential counseling services that are free to students who are currently enrolled. We provide same-day urgent consultations in the event of a crisis. We currently have 10 counselors who are trained to respond in the event of a same-day urgent need. There are 3 regular counselors who are on our staff. That's Andre Fields, Emily Nisley, and myself, who provide those services, ongoing counseling services for students. We also do a lot of programming around workshops and coping skills, strategies for mental health. Also, we have the suicide prevention grant here at GRCC, which is in its last 6 months, so also coordinating those efforts on campus as well. Okay, Joe.
Great, thank you. My next question, as I'm reading it, well, this is a multi-part question, but this question kind of touches on a number of different areas, since you all have experiences in a number of different areas in this issue. And so what are some of the layers of support, both on campus and the community, which you've already talked about some of them? And then this is more a Kimberly question. What are kind of the specific steps of a Title IX process here on campus? And then in general, what resources have you seen to be most impactful for healing and recovery, which could be all folks from professional and personal standpoint?
I'm going to start with process and then get to support. Is that okay? So if we have a complaint, concern, report, any of those things come to us, it can come from a number of ways. So students certainly can walk in our door and make a complaint or raise a concern. My office is in the Bostwick office suites, formerly the data center underneath the Bostwick parking ramp, in that mirrored office that a lot of people don't even know is an actual office. So I try to get out and around as much as possible. You can make a report directly to me. You can walk in the door. A lot of people also talk to faculty or staff or advisors of student organizations and make a complaint or a report to them, and then they will refer it on to me. So if we get a report from anyone about anything that falls within our sexual misconduct policy, sexual harassment, stalking, sexual exploitation, domestic or dating violence, we will reach out to the person involved, the student, I'll say for these purposes, reach out to the student involved. And invite them to a conversation about what they would like to do and what resources they might need and what support we can provide. So if the other person involved, the perpetrator of whatever happened, is within our jurisdiction, so is a student or a community member at GRCC, then we would talk about the possibility of investigation that could result in sanctions within our conduct code. But if they're not, and a lot of times they're not, then our conversation focuses on resources. And we talk about ways that we can support that student. Again, they don't have to be involved with the process if they don't want to, but they can, and we can kind of tailor it to whatever they want. So if a student comes to me and says, I'm being harassed by someone in my class, then we would have a conversation about moving someone from the class. We would have a conversation probably with a faculty member if the student wanted us to. We would potentially do an investigation, again, if the student wanted us to, and we would potentially involve campus police, again, if the student wanted us to. So we try to focus a lot on what the reporting person wants to happen. One of the common questions that we ask always is, what does the conclusion of this look like for you? What does appropriate resolution, a fair resolution look like to you? What is it that you want to see from this? Sometimes people say, I want the other person expelled. Sometimes people say, I just don't want to see this person. And sometimes people say, I just need support in this moment. So we try to tailor our response to whatever it is that they need at that time, knowing, of course, that that can change and that what you need now might not be what you need in 6 months, and that's fine. So when we have that initial conversation that can obviously turn into multiple conversations, one of the things that we're looking at is referring folks to resources. So Stacey and I have worked together this year to try to do a much quicker referral than we were doing before to counseling, and to get folks in to talk to a counselor, even if it's on a crisis basis, just a quicker, shorter follow-up to do kind of some crisis intervention, and then to set up either a longer-term crisis, or I'm sorry, a longer-term counseling relationship, or to refer. And then I always refer people to the YWCA for their support groups and counseling. So I'm sharing that information and making those referrals, and then I'll let you all speak more detail to what happens and then what's maybe most helpful.
So through our support group, I want to kind of refer back to something that Morgan said earlier in terms of just having that group of survivors to share with initially, and I think that's really important, to have connection with other people who have been through something similar can be very healing and help that person be on the road to recovery. So that's a significant piece that we offer. I want to mention, in terms of the services at the YWCA, everything I talked about earlier, all of those services are free. There is no cost to receiving a sexual assault medical forensic examination. We get reimbursed by the state of Michigan, not the full cost of the exam, but we do not charge victims for their receiving an examination from us. So I mentioned the advocacy. That is also an important part of what a person can connect to as far as services at the YWCA. And it's relatively short term. It's not therapy, but it again can help that individual who may just be starting to come to terms with what has happened to them and be ready to start talking about it, can help them navigate through that process.
So when a student first arrives in the Counseling and Career Development Center, and actually all students are assessed for any symptoms they may have been experiencing within the past 2 weeks. And that's for all students, because we care about your mental health. We want to know how things are going, how you're feeling, in ways that we can help you in that respect. But I do want to reaffirm that the services are confidential. There are limits to confidentiality, and that's all reviewed in that first session together during the intake process. But in the event, perhaps Kimberly would give me a referral, at that point, I may know that someone may be arriving, but after that point, it is confidential. Kimberly doesn't receive any other information regarding that student at that point. Probably the first question that we would ask would be a simple, how are you doing? Not a what happened, but to give time to unpack a story in the time that is needed. So it's a very student or client, as we might say, focused care, helping that individual recognize some of those symptoms, perhaps a sense of hypervigilance, for example, and understanding that your body tells the story before your mind knows what you're experiencing, helping to find the words to talk, and taking the time once some strategies are in place for coping, and also being very, very well aware of any self-judgments that might be taking place and helping you to identify those self-judgments. And we work with a lot of compassion, self-compassion, self-kindness, self-care. I would say we approach many of our students regardless of what's bringing you in, but certainly for those who've experienced the trauma of sexual assault. At times, too, we also make referrals for ongoing counseling to the YWCA as well. But, you know, starting with us, working with us is a very good first step. And again, all of our services are free and confidential.
So I would stress for survivors from my firsthand experience, self-care and self-compassion, because it can be difficult in the aftermath of trauma to feel like you are worth resources. And those resources have made a world of a difference in my life, and the community that comes along with that can expedite the healing process or the coping process. So making sure that you are allowing yourself to experience and access the community that surrounds you, because these people are out here and they're ready and willing to support you along the way.
Can I interact with that question and ask you in response? Are there ways that you think from our process that we can be more helpful in terms of affirming that you are worth resources? I am intrigued by that phrase you used. Are there things that we can do to aid in that likelihood maybe that someone would use those resources, that someone would engage with that?
Yeah, so we had talked a little bit earlier about making sure that people know that these resources are available regardless of whether or not you're going to apply specific language to an experience. So a survivor may not want to use the language sexual assault, but they might say, you know, that thing that happened on Saturday night. Making sure that these resources and the providers of the resources express that they are not there to judge in that moment, but that they're there to help, and they are happy to help, regardless of language, I think is super important.
I'll just ask again to anyone. One thing that we've tried to do recently, and someone had pointed this out to us, was to circle back with people. And I'd be curious maybe too, from your perspective, Patti, one of the things that we saw at first was we would offer resources, we would send resources, have a conversation about those things, and then not be sure what had happened with that, whether someone had taken advantage of that, whether someone was at a place where they could. So one thing we've tried to do based on what we've seen is to go back maybe a month or 2 or 3 later to say, we're still here. If anything's changed, if you want to talk now, you can still do any of those things that you could do before, you can still do now. So I'd be curious for anyone else's thoughts on that, maybe ways we can do that better, but the commonality of that experience, that someone might not necessarily be ready to take advantage of some of those things now, that might be several months down the road, especially thinking about like a more formal process from, if we're thinking of a disciplinary process through Title IX, that someone certainly might not be ready to go down that path.
I can speak to what we do at the YWCA as far as following up. So after an examination, our nurse manager will contact that survivor within a few days of the examination, touching base, see how they're doing, see if the nurse can answer any questions. And as part of that phone contact, the nurse will ask, have you gotten connected to our counseling services? Are you interested in doing that? And the nurse can transfer that call to the receptionist, who can set an appointment if they are interested in doing that. And then about 3 months later, we have another follow-up phone call that's conducted by an advocate to, it's kind of got a double purpose. One is to, again, see how they're doing and to conduct somewhat of a satisfaction survey, if you will, in terms of how they feel about how they were treated in the process. And part of the purpose of that is to give us feedback to improve our services. And then again, to see if they are connected with counseling services, and if not, that step can be taken to connect them. But I think, it's true that in the immediate aftermath, there may be that feeling of, I'm not worthy or worth receiving any services. They're feeling so badly about themselves that they're not ready at that point. And so I think it's important to make those subsequent contacts, and hopefully we will catch them at a time when they are ready.
Great, thank you. Next question, a little bit of a change of pace, but one of the things that Morgan touched on a little bit in her speech was a push towards legislative and policy reform, both at the state level and at institutions of education like GRCC. So as Title IX and kind of the public outlook on these issues has changed over the years and institutional policy has changed, what changes have you seen that have been the most positive for survivors, and what places does law and policy still need to catch up?
A big question. Literally working on our sexual misconduct policy this afternoon. It's on my to-do list as we speak. So if anyone has input they would like to provide, please do that. That would be a great time. Morgan referenced this in her talk, but we're just at such an interesting place in Title IX world right now. So there was back, 5-6 years ago, maybe, a slow development, or maybe not a slow development, maybe a quick development of more regulations around Title IX, specifically through question and answer documents and FAQ documents and Dear Colleague letters and all of these publications that the Office of Civil Rights put out during the Obama administration that really clarified and expanded upon the original understanding of what we needed to do as institutions under Title IX. And there were a lot of guidance documents, a lot of information that was in those that wasn't formal regulations, hadn't gone through the lawmaking process, but really we're treated that way. And institutions, including GRCC, really carved and created our policies around those things. And I think largely rightly so. And they did a lot of good and positive changes for everyone, really, for institutions and for our due process and for our protections, and hopefully for those involved in the process. What we're seeing now is interesting because it's changing a lot of that in an intriguing way. Morgan, I think, referenced earlier some more recent proposed regulations that are looking at due process in a different way, that are trying to focus on more respondents and rights for those who are accused in the process, which is certainly not a bad thing. And we want to make our policy and processes as balanced and fair as possible. But I think what we're hearing a lot of too is that survivors and complainants is the word we use in our policy, people who are bringing concerns forward, don't necessarily feel heard, and that they maybe own that process as much as was maybe the former interpretation. So those aren't final yet, so we'll see if some of those concerns, how that kind of all plays out. Our policies at GRCC are very carefully crafted, and again, in progress, to edit them, and we take them to every 2 years, look back at our sexual misconduct policy and say, okay, what's changed, what hasn't changed, what do we want to make better? There's other laws and policies, Violence Against Women Act, Clery Act, that you'll hear that also play into specific things that we have to do in our policies. And those give some very clear guidance on education, what we need to educate about, what we need to be talking about, that we have to provide examples within our education. So some really specific things that we are responsible to do, which I think is a good thing. But it's just an interesting time right now because there's a lot of regulations out there and they're not final. So we don't really know how that's going to end up and what that's going to look like ultimately. And again, some of that is process. So that some of that is when we notify people, what we tell them when we notify them. So as we look at our policies and our processes, we're certainly always open to what works best and best practice, but also trying to be mindful of folks who have gone through the process and feedback that they might provide as to the feeling of fairness and the feeling that they were heard and had an opportunity to say what they wanted to say, regardless of whether they were, regardless of what the outcome was. I'm not sure that I answered your question, but
no, that's
all
great.
my thoughts on that.
So the YWCA connection to Title IX, it comes in the form of our doing training at colleges and universities locally. We've done training here at GRCC. I've done training at Calvin and Grand Valley, and all addressing the helping staff and folks at the colleges and universities understand the trauma of sexual assault and understand potential survivor reactions that may not make sense to them. So we are attempting to meet the needs of those institutions to have that education.
Yeah, so I touched on the fact that I have taken on Title IX advocacy in the aftermath of Betsy DeVos, Secretary DeVos, proposing her changes to Title IX interpretation. And as a survivor, as someone who tries to speak on behalf of survivors, I always advocate for a trauma-informed, survivor-centric approach. That is not to say that I want an unbalanced Title IX process, but I believe that it is possible to achieve a trauma-informed and empathetic environment while we're still conducting these reviews. And so I think that protecting people from re-victimization in the aftermath of an assault should be one of our utmost priorities. Protecting the mental health of both parties should be one of our utmost priorities. And I am extremely concerned about the way that these new regulations are going to be interpreted and incorporated into our universities across the country.
I think you hit on a really essential point there because you articulated that the regulations can be whatever they are, but it really, I think the difference is made depending on how universities and colleges interpret them and what we do with them. So for instance, the regulations can say, here is something that you need to do. For instance, you reference cross-examination. So for instance, you need to allow cross-examination in your hearings, but institutions can enact that requirement in all sorts of different ways, some of which might feel much more empathetic, to use your word, fair, appropriate, victim-centered, or just remembering that we're all people involved in this process. So I think that's really going to be where we at GRCC, but every school, is really going to look at our culture and look at who we want to be and how we want to implement those things with as much care and concern as possible for the people who are involved.
Great, thank you. And I want to make sure we have time to open up for questions from everyone else, but I wanted to end our formal part of the panel with the question. So we've got a lot of great expertise at the front of the room, folks that are supporting survivors all the time, but supporting survivors is something we can all do, right? Regardless of our expertise. So how would you recommend that we do that as students, as faculty, staff, friends, family, et cetera? Yeah.
So quite often, people are not aware of how pervasive this issue is and how common it is. So I think that first and foremost, checking in on your friends and family and just seeing how they're doing. Being a supportive member of your community, whatever your community looks like. And so being prepared for something like this to be disclosed to you, educating yourself as to what trauma looks like in the aftermath of an assault, and what it looks like to support somebody who's going through this.
And on the supporting end, we have a lot of folks who will call our office and say, this happened to my friend, or my friend told me about this. So if they disclose to you, what are you going to do with it? So I think that's a really great way to be an ally. I think that goes along with what you were saying, is if you know about this, you can also help your friend disclose, come with your friend, let your friend know where the resources are. If they don't know, kind of do the digging for them so that it's as easy as possible. I think that's a great way. And coming with them, we have a lot of faculty who come with students to meet with us. We have other students who come with them. That's fine, you can do that. So don't hesitate to reach out and watch out for your friends and your students, colleagues, also true.
I think one of the key things to remember is if someone tells you that this has happened to them, it's important to believe them. You know, I think about those initial victim survivors of Nassar who weren't believed, and how, you know, this person who was held in high esteem at Michigan State University, no one could believe that he was doing something so horrendous. And so, you know, I think it's really important to approach this issue by believing and then providing that support and advocacy.
To that, because that's exactly what I was thinking. It reminded me too of the investigation, Lieutenant Munson, who began, Munford, I'm sorry, thank you, who began simply by adopting that perspective, start by believing. And I think that that's what really opened up in many ways a space for victims to talk and tell their story in the way that they needed to tell it. Was. So to have that internal perspective of starting by believing, no judgments, lots of compassion, self-compassion for those who've endured, and a lot of kindness as well. I don't know that questions and questions and questions and questions is the best way to support someone who's been through the experience, at least certainly not from a mental health or helping perspective, to be a good pair of ears and to listen with your whole experience.
Great. Thank you all so much. So that concludes the formal portion of the panel. Now we want to open it up for your questions. So we've got about 20 minutes or so, and it can be open for all the panelists. You can ask a specific person or ask the group in general. Also, please be mindful of the survivors in the room and make sure your questions are relevant and respectful. So I'll pass around the microphone as needed. Please raise your hand and we'll try your best to go in order. Yes.
Thank you. So my question is mostly for Morgan. We know what we know about sexual assault is that a lot of people do come onto campus already being a survivor of an assault. And I know that yours was specific to one campus, but you're a student on another campus. What do you wish your current school had done to support you? Because technically, they didn't, need to do anything because you weren't assaulted on that campus. What did they do to support you, and what do you wish they had done to support you to make the last year a little easier?
That's a really great question. So I think, first of all, tying back to the statistics that we know that a lot of college students are arriving to campus having been assaulted before they arrived on campus, increasing our education and training at a younger age, I would argue is very, very necessary so that we can start to educate people about what this looks like and how we cope with things like this, because we know that it's happening to children. But specific to my situation, I wish that when I had arrived on campus that mental health resources had been more accessible. I think especially with the publicity surrounding my case, it compounded the trauma of undergoing this experience, undergoing the sentencing experience after this had occurred years prior, and then seeing about it everywhere on screens. Additionally, I would, in a perfect world, I think I would ask of professionals at my university that they be mindful of survivors in the room when they're going to talk about potentially triggering content.
Are there any like specific services that Grand Rapids Community College, because I know you probably have commuters that have been assaulted off of campus, but what kind of services do you provide here for them?
So really the same things that we would provide if somebody disclosed something that happened. Now, when we train folks on reporting things to us, faculty, for instance, when we train on, if you find out about this, report it to us. We don't usually give any sort of, if it happened within the past year or the past 5 years, and we get a fair amount, not surprisingly, of reports that have come in from something that happened in childhood or young adulthood, and now, you know, it's 10 years later. So we do the same things. We reach out, offer a conversation, offer resources, all of you, counseling, YWCA, and typically ask, you know, if you want to talk, we can talk more about specific resources to you. What we found a lot of times is, and this isn't specific to folks who have been survivors younger necessarily, but when we reach out to talk about resources, a lot of other concerns come up, right? Food insecurity, housing insecurity, issues with transportation, and those are often things we can help with too. So if those things come to us in the context of this, then we can hopefully more holistically serve whatever it is that student needs in that moment.
My name is DeAndre Jones. I just want to know, what type of policies would you like to see changed at the state level that you feel like they haven't really been able to get, that you would like to see implemented within the next few years? This is a very touchy subject, but I'm very passionate about advocating and helping people with stuff like this.
I might be the only one who's safe to talk about that. So part of the package of bills that I introduced with my sister survivors included eliminating governmental immunity for institutions that protect or enable sexual abusers. Making sure that just because your employer is a government entity, that you are not exempt from justice and from the law. In addition, and this is quite controversial, but I am an advocate for eliminating the statute of limitations for cases of specifically childhood sexual abuse, because what we have found is that a lot of the time people don't disclose or come into clarity with what happened to them until they are much, much older. And so by the time that they may have come to grips with an experience that they had as a child, their access to justice could be just completely gone. So those are two in particular, but I'd love to talk with you afterwards about where we're moving as a state and where you think that we should be.
I think one thing too, I'll add to that those are really two intriguing ideas. I like those. I would also add that, you know, we're a community college, and a lot of times when the requirements are created, it's focused on four-year institutions, and that's federally or statewide. A lot of times the training requirements, the reporting requirements are with four-year institutions in mind. There's some laws that passed this past summer that distinguish us, so in a way that was helpful. It changes our requirements, but it would certainly, and I've heard this from 4-year and 2-year institutions, that it would certainly be helpful to have a serious and real conversation about what our resources are and what we can do and how we can maybe collaborate. And Morgan and I even talked about this earlier today, how we can collaborate with other 4-year or 2-year institutions to look at, okay, how can we combine our resources to say, okay, we're going to do these investigations really well, we're going to do this training really well, because we're going to maybe all do it together versus us each trying to figure it out on our own. So more collaboration and maybe more statewide leadership in that collaboration is always helpful. And I think we're seeing some of that and have seen some of that, but to continue that trajectory would be awesome.
Hi there, my name is Tatiana Diaz. I am the editor-in-chief of the Collegiate. So I'm wondering, have you had any past students come forward and make any reports? And if you have, what do you do with those students? What are some of the things that that Title IX does to help those former students? And I mean, is it the same kind of process?
You mean students who were students when something happened and now are no longer students when they come?
Right.
Okay. So typically, we would still have pretty much the same process as far as if they wanted some sort of a formal investigation, then what we would be looking at is whether the person who was responsible, the respondent, was a student at the time or was a GRCC employee or student at the time that whatever happened. But regardless of whether that's the case, we would be providing the same resources, having the same conversation, offering to meet the same as we would if they were still a student. If they are no longer our student but at another institution, then I would also try to connect them with their resources if they wanted that. For instance, if they were at Grand Valley, a lot of people transfer there. If they were at Grand Valley now, we could connect them with their Title IX coordinator resources and that sort of thing. But the fact that they weren't currently a student wouldn't really make a difference other than we would be pointing them to somewhere else, maybe or outside agencies for counseling and ongoing support like that. But we would still engage with them and offer those resources.
Thank you. I also had just one more question. My question is for Morgan. What advice do you have for someone who is maybe in the midst of it right now and hasn't come forward, but it's something that they're considering? Or what would you say to someone in that case?
That is a question that comes up a lot, and it's difficult to whittle it down to just one thing because I feel like there's so much to unpack in that experience. I would advise people, if they are keeping this and holding this with themselves, to allow themselves and that they deserve to have support from their community. So they ought to allow themselves, when they are ready and safe, to feel the love and support of a family member or of a friend or a spiritual leader, because alleviating the burden by telling someone had made such a huge difference in my situation. But realizing that you are valid and worth doing so, worth taking that action and deserving of some sort of closure or healing is so important to communicate to survivors.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, as a student, how can I help maybe other students going through this? Like, how can I get this word out? Because I never knew about any of these resources. So is there a way that I can help as a student, other students?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not going to let that hang out there. Yes, there is. There are lots of ways. If you would like to connect, Joe or I, either of us, would love to chat with you more afterwards. Same with anybody. But in general, you can certainly contact us. We send a training out at the beginning of the semester. It's in your Blackboard course as well. There's our contact information there, or you can search Title IX on the GRCC website. We do a lot of training with student organizations. We do some in-person training with other groups. And actually, I met with someone else recently about ways that we can involve students more. So we are definitely open to ideas and support and more thoughts. I think that's the kind of trajectory we're trying to move, is getting more student input into how you can support one another and how you can help and how we can educate one another. That was one thing Morgan had spoken about earlier. In all the different ways and whatever that looks like for what you're maybe interested in. So yeah, Joe, would you add anything to that based on our conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. As someone who works in student life, we want to see more on this campus, and we want to see more students that are excited and passionate. And I have talked to plenty of students that have a similar mentality but don't know where to start. And especially like today, you know, we had a lunch with students with Morgan earlier today, and had a handful of students that were active on campus. And to see the ideas around the room and the excitement and interest in it makes me excited. I wish we were at the start of a semester and not getting towards the end of the year, so that we could get so much more going here in the next few weeks. But yeah, we definitely want to do more and work with the students, because we're here for the students to help make things happen and to support you in the best way we can. So we'll chat.
Give us your information before you leave.
Yes, we will chat.
And also, Morgan, maybe you add to that.
Yeah, I was just gonna offer my contact information as well, because while I am a student, I'm not a student here, but I can always try to help from Ann Arbor.
And I can speak to if there is interest in helping at the YWCA. We have a trained advocate who is involved in every case that comes through the nurse examiner program. So during a daytime case, it would be a staff person such as myself, but at night and on the weekend, it would be a trained volunteer. And there are letters over there on the table that explain the process and what would be expected of going through training and the shifts that would be required per month. And we actually have a volunteer training coming up later in April, so the timing is good. If this is something that you're interested in, I invite you to take a letter about that. And if I can just walk through some of these other resources, there's a sheet over there that looks like this that lists the YWCA Sexual Assault Awareness Month activities, so things going on through the month of April. And I want to highlight the very last day of April. We are hosting a film screening and panel discussion of the bystander moment at the YWCA. So we invite you and encourage you to come to that as well. There are brochures of YWCA services over there, and then also like business-size cards that have our 24-hour helpline number on them. And I believe that's it.
We also have a lot of resources and brochures from our Title IX office and other resources on campus at GRCC, as well as an assortment of swag, including avocado stress balls. So please stop at the table before you head out. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Morgan, my question is for you. My name is Jennifer Ackerman Haywood. I teach journalism here at GRCC and advise student media. And I know in my own career, I have interviewed survivors many times. And it's one of those things as journalists, sometimes we show up at the worst day of a person's life. With survivors, they usually seek us out when they're ready. What advice do you have for journalists, especially young journalists that are learning how to properly and kindly engage with people who've been through traumatic things? What advice do you have for young journalists? And maybe if you can talk a little bit about what your experience was like dealing with the media.
Yeah, so it's been That's a really, really interesting question. It's been a mixed bag when it comes to dealing with media in my specific experience. I've had interactions with really, really great reporters, and then I've had interactions with reporters who might be great, but they're really not great about talking about sexual violence. I think that doing a basic understanding of the dynamics of trauma can go miles to making the interview less painful for both parties, and being cognizant of the words that you use and the way that you might phrase a question can impact someone's interpretation of it a lot. So I think avoiding things that could be construed as victim blaming is something that is just across the board. It benefits the journalist, it benefits the participating survivor, and I think it benefits our culture because people consuming that media will not consume the same victim blaming or victim shaming rhetoric that we've seen for a long time.
Great, thank you. And we might have a few minutes here at the end. If you have any personal questions that you'd like to come and ask folks, they might be able to stick around for at least a few minutes, and make sure to get contact info of folks in the room if that was mentioned. So please, first of all, before I forget, give them all a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you, Stacey, Patti, Kimberly, for offering your expertise, Morgan as well, and for sharing your story. Thank you so much. That means a lot. I also wanted to thank the library for hosting this space, Brian, Tony, everybody that works here. Kimberly was also on the planning committee for this event, so thank you especially for that. This has been great. I appreciate everyone coming out and supporting. This means a lot. You all have the power to raise awareness on this and help change the culture of our country. So, especially the students in the room, you're our up-and-coming leaders, so please, please, please use your voice, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and have a great day. Thank you.